everyone. Welcome. We are excited for you to join us at this TPRC poolside chat. I am Derrick Cogburn, a professor of environment, development, and health in the School of International Service and professor of information technology and analytics in the Kogod School of Business, both at American University, where I also serve as the UNESCO Associate Chair in Transnational Challenges and Governance. I'm also delighted to serve as a board member of TPRC and a member of our community building committee, which has organized this series of poolside chats for the summer. And I have just returned from Geneva, where I participated in the inaugural UN Global Dialogue on AI Governance and the AI for Good Global Summit. This was a very, very exciting opportunity to see the results of the Independent Scientific Committee on AI, and it does help to pave the way for our discussion today. So this afternoon, I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Christos Makridis, Associate Research Professor at Arizona State University's W.P. Carey School of Business, a digital fellow at Stanford's Digital Economy Lab, where he studies the economics of remote work and AI, and a senior researcher at Gallup, where he draws on one of the richest longitudinal workforce panels in the country to study how AI actually moves through workplaces and economies. Much of Christos's work draws on the Gallup Workforce Panel, tens of thousands of US employees tracked over time to show how AI adoption actually spreads inside organizations and how much of it comes down to managers and strategy rather than the technology itself. In addition to this background, we are especially happy to have Dr. Makridis here as a member of an upcoming panel at TPRC 54 in September called Measuring AI Beyond Compute. That title captures a real tension in our field. Most of our policy conversations fixate on things that are relatively easy to count: model size, training compute, benchmark scores. But the value, the risk, and the disruption of AI doesn't happen only in the model. They happen downstream, inside firms, agencies, and platforms. They are shaped by managers, workflows, skills, and data systems. Dr. Makridis' work highlights all of these aspects of AI adoption and impact. And what's striking is that the UN's new Independent Scientific Panel on AI just made the same argument in their preliminary report. The thing to evaluate is the deployed system, not the model alone. So today, thanks to Christos, we're going to go deep inside the organization. So Christos, your panel at TPRC 54 is called Measuring AI Beyond Compute. So what does the phrase beyond compute mean? And from your perspective, what's missing from the current AI policy debates?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Derrick. Awesome intro and honor to be here. So yeah, the panel is going to be really fun. We're going to have Wayne Layden from the FCC. We're going to have Josephine. We're going to have Christopher Yu, and we're all going to talk a little bit about AI governance, but as you said, beyond compute. And I think you kind of already said the answer in one sense, that a lot of the conversations around AI have been around computing capabilities, and we talk about the latest model that came out and what the benchmark is. But the reality on the ground is that it's not just the technical capabilities, it's also about the organizational constraints or regulatory constraints. And not all constraints are bad. In one sense, it's kind of good that we can't just go from 0 to 100 in a second. And so constraints can sometimes be good, inertia can sometimes be good. But yeah, just think of it in one extreme situation. You can have a model that can, think about like writing content for a marketing strategy company, but the CEO of the company says to the team, you can't use LLMs. Well, you could capability wise, it could do content marketing, but deployability wise, it's a complete no-go. So now most organizations, it's not a complete yes or no. It's a how do you phase it in? What tasks do you use it on? And in particular, how do the managers develop the right processes to integrate LLMs in a smart way? And I'll stop at kind of this monologue in just a second. But the one thing I want to really, I think, harp on, this will come up during the panel, is that that there's all this discussion about the costs and like token maxing that organizations are going through. And right now, I think a lot of frontier labs just want to get more users on the platform, so they're willing to take the kind of bite the bullet in the short run if it means getting a lot of users that are sort of like really attached to the products. But eventually the cost will change. And so then one of the big differentiating factors is going to be how do organizations establish the right workflows so that when somebody uses an LLM, they know which LLM to use. So, take an open weight model versus a Fable version. Or what sort of workflows, who to be talking to, who's already done that work that then you can pull from. And so there's going to be all these organizational practices that get developed. And that's a topic of a separate paper, AI tokenomics in the firm. But yeah, as you kind of pointed out, there's just so many organizational practices that, for better or for worse, can constrain the deployability. And where the future of organizations is going to be is how do we establish those right processes and what are the structural factors that need to be in place? So yeah, we're really excited for the panel and excited for this conversation.
Absolutely. And you really put your finger on something. If you look at what's happened over the last few weeks, you mentioned Fable. That's essentially what just happened, right? When Fable became available again, it was included as part of a subscription. So you could use Fable, kind of get your feet wet, get used to it, the power of this, sort of frontier model. But they said it was available until the 15th of July. Then they said the 17th, and then they said the 19th. And this morning there was a note that said, if you want to use Fable, now it's part of a subscription package where you pay now for compute for using the model, and so they gave everybody $100 of free token access, but it's
Gonna
no
run
longer
out quick.
exactly. It's
Yeah.
going to run out very quickly.
Yeah.
So that pricing model is already starting to change.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I mean, this is where a lot more research, kind of at the intersection of law, economics, strategy, is going to have to, converge to is like, how do we build those models? In one sense, we don't really like they're thinking about like the frontier labs are thinking about this right now, and so I guess I don't know, we could maybe interview them, ask them how they're thinking about pricing. But I think one thing is for sure is that there's so much tacit information in organizations, and where LLMs can do a really good job is like pulling together unstructured information, but you don't want to have to keep going through that every time. So you want to like digest all that unstructured data and then establish a process so that going forward, you don't need to like keep reinventing the wheel. So use Fable 5 for like the hardest things, but then after that's been established, after that foundation's been laid, then hopefully like open weight models are able to do a little bit more of the heavy lifting.
That's a fantastic way to think about this. So if we understand that individual level adoption is important for understanding the economic impacts of AI, what do we learn by looking inside an organization that the model capabilities themselves can't tell us? What do we learn by looking inside an organization at individual level adoption?
Yeah. Well, let me start with like a very kind of like more like a basic question of like why talk to people? And that sounds like a ridiculous answer because of course we're talking right now, we talk to our families and so on. But sometimes within our profession, we look at like firm level data, administrative data, and that's all really good. But one of the things that Gallup has just done for decades upon decades is just asking people what they think and what they do. And so in the Gallup workforce panel, we've been collecting 20,000 respondents that are sharing their attitudes about their employer, about their managers, and so on. But crucially, we also ask about AI utilization. So how often are you using AI as well as what are you using it on? And so when you go to the underlying worker, you're getting a little bit higher signal than noise because if you go to the firm, I mean, we still need firm level surveys, and I definitely don't want this comment to come off as a negative against firm level. But when you go to the worker, you get as on the ground truth as possible. When you go to the firm, you sometimes get what they wish could be done, but not always what is going on. And so, a paper that we'll have coming out soon as a BEA working paper, together with Tina Highfill and John Samuels of the BEA. I show that we so benchmark with the Census BTOS data, the Business Trends and Outlook survey. And one of the things that we find is that when you go to workers and ask them about their use of AI, that proportion is much higher than what you would get at a firm level. So I think point number one is that going to workers and asking them what what are you, how often are you using AI? What are you using it on? You get a little bit more of the ground truth. The second thing that come back to and more precisely to the kind of question is, well, you get a little bit more information on the frictions that actually exist in the organization. And a lot of times it's not, rocket science, like what is problematic within a firm. So take, for example, we ask about trust in senior leadership. We ask about, do you feel respected at work? And so for a worker that doesn't trust their senior leadership, then when the enterprise decides to adopt AI, well, if there's not that trust that exists, then anything that happens, AI or non-AI related, is going to be met with resistance, skepticism, or at least it's not going to have the full effect. And so that's one of the kind of key results in this paper about the managerial transmission of AI is that managers have an incredible amount of influence beyond the top level kind of CEO policy. Managers are kind of that middle level layer that transmits the efficacy of formal policy to underlying workers. And that's especially true, I think, for multinational organizations where you got people from different cultures, different geographies, different, age brackets and so on, and having managers that are trusted and are able to communicate the why, the how, lastly, I'd say it's not just, I think one of the other challenges sometimes in org behavior is that we think it's just a communication issue. No, sometimes it's not just communication. Sometimes it's the manager really needs to study what is happening on the ground because there is an actual friction point that needs to be solved. So it's that feedback loop where the manager is the on the ground ear for the organization to figure out what problems are there and to communicate. So I think managers play an integral role. And a lot of the issues that we're dealing with aren't new per se. They just take a new shape because it's a new technology, but it's the same structural issue.
So if we push that just a little bit further, so some of your panel research, you've been able to sort of unpack this use at kind of a hierarchical level where you compare senior leaders to individual contributors, and you're measuring this idea of frequent AI usage, I think it is, and you found a differentiation between the high frequent use of AI among senior leaders, while many individual contributors are in the low 20s or something like that. So tell us a little bit about what that hierarchy means and what are the implications of that differentiation.
Yeah, well, so in the raw data, so I think the simple answer in one sense is that in the raw data, there are major differences across the hierarchy of a firm. And within personnel and organizational economics, we have theories about the span of control. And so, like, CEO might be more likely to adopt ICT because these technologies are going to kind of amplify reach. So it's going to be relatively more important for the CEO to have email than it is for a junior person. Now, I mean, now that's email is ubiquitous, but a lot of those are the predictions early on in the internet revolution. So yeah, we see a lot different trends, higher adoption rates, like by by 3 times as much at senior levels than individual contributors. But you still do see individual contributors using it. Now, you could argue that this is just composition effects, that CEOs are doing things that are more AI inducing or like require software more than frontline. And while that's true, it's also the case that within organizational hierarchies that there's a little bit more leverage in certain positions to be able to use AI. So I think that the story to have in your mind is that in research it's like maybe you would ask your RA to like pull some data, but there's a transaction cost associated with that communication. It takes time to communicate, and so instead of maybe asking an RA to just like pull this data set, maybe now we can ask Claude Code to write up a script to pull something or do whatever, and then you save the more complex and more resource intensive tasks for the person. And so I think it leads to this kind of interesting division of labor. But I also don't want to make it sound like all daisies and ponies because it is going to be tough. Like this does mean that there's going to be certain work that an RA would have expected to get, and this is part of the big debate that goes on in AI and future work. It's like, what if the RA kind of needed those tasks in order to level up? And so there is a little bit of tension there. I think not to go off on a whole separate detour, but I'll maybe wrap it up with this point is that I think there's going to be more responsibility on us, and so the prospective RA maybe needs to kind of train themselves in more of their self-imposed toils rather than relying on the kind of grunt work that they would normally get through their RA ship. And so we sort of are living in this era where, anything is possible, but because so much is possible, that then sometimes we say, look, deer in the headlights, what do I do? So more responsibility, but I don't know. There's that good Spider-Man quote of with great power comes great
Great
responsibility. So
responsibility,
yeah,
absolutely, and I worry about that to a certain extent. The idea that um, research assistants are going to not take the easy route, but to find ways to stumble and to push back against output from LLMs, and to um, create ways for them to train themselves on something that they need to get better at. There are all kinds of ways you can use the technology that way that I'm not sure many incoming early career researchers will do necessarily.
yeah. Well, but this is exactly why good managers are going to be so important. Our CEO, John Clifton at Gallup, had this really good quote around, and I forget like what it was verbatim, but it was along the lines of, if you're good at management, what does good at management actually mean? That's a good open question, and maybe just to dwell 20 seconds on that. Well, so you know how to set expectations, you know how to signal appreciation, you know how to take feedback and give feedback, and probably the list will go on. So if you're good at those sorts of practices, you're probably going to be good at working with an LLM as well because you are the manager of that. Autonomous agent. And so I think this is just going to accentuate the value of good management expertise. And that also exists within a university. Then it's like your ability to give feedback and ability to direct and guide a junior scholar, a PhD candidate, an undergraduate is just going to become more important as well. And sometimes we don't always get that training. So sometimes we're going to have to just learn it ourselves and, build up. And I mean, this is one reason why groups like TPRC is so critical because this is a form of professionalization. This is part of the way that we enculturate ourselves and other people is by being in community. So I don't want any of my comments to come off as like LLM is going to replace that. It's just that it's going to shift that task distribution. And then that enculturation process is probably going to become more important than ever.
Right. And I think we have to have more mechanisms that train and force students to go through that process so that they can come out and into the workforce uh, uh, better prepared to have that back and forth with an LLM that they need to have.
Yeah.
I'm teaching a new course in the fall where it's AI for global challenges, and I'm trying to get students to sort of stumble and use these tools to push them and to push back on the tools as well.
Oh
Um,
my gosh. So that makes me think one R&D project that we're working on is looking at, so if you were to ask an LLM, like what does age 27-year-old in Nigeria think about their economy? The LLM will come up with an answer. Now, his question is it like remotely accurate? So one thing that we've been doing is benchmarking that with what our world poll data. So for those that are listening that don't know about the world poll, since 2006, so Jim Clifton had this really, ambitious vision of could we survey basically the world and get nationally representative samples from every country in the world? And so that became the world poll. So we'll see a 27-year-old in Nigeria, and we can actually line up what is the LLM's belief about the Nigerian, the 27-year-olds versus actual. And so yeah, this is such a cool data set. And we're
I
actually
love it.
experimenting with some classes where, people query and they're able to get to actually line it up with what's on the ground. What are people
Yep.
actually saying?
Well, let's definitely talk about that a bit more later. So back to growth in frequent use for AI. You have some data, it looks like, that shows that post 2024 growth came from a category of users that are occasional users who convert to frequent use, but not as many new adopters. So why does that shift matter in how we measure AI adoption?
Yeah, so one of the term of arts that we've developed internally is this concept of a frequent AI user. Now, what does frequent mean and where do you draw the line? So we have people answering these questions about their frequency of use of AI, and it goes from daily, daily, multiple times a week, multiple times a month, so like basically like once a month, and then kind of like a never category, so a non-user. So we identify the frequent AI users as those that are doing it daily or multiple times a week, and that share has grown a lot, and a lot of it has come from these people that are experimenting. And so like when ChatGPT really met the zeitgeist in 2022, 2023, people might have, piloted it, but they were more using it out of curiosity. And you saw a lot of it, I mean, on social media, things went viral, but it didn't really actually integrate into the workflow. Arguably because it wasn't that good. It wasn't like, I mean, you couldn't, like, it was hallucinating all the time and so on. So I think a lot of that frequent category just became people that, experimented more and were like, hey, I can use this to do BibTeX citations in LaTeX. I can use this to as something that I've enjoyed using it for, using it to write code, but it wasn't great at writing code before. Using it to like test mathematical proofs. It's actually enormously good at doing mathematical proofs right now. And so I think the experimentation leading to frequent use. Now, one thing that is actually a little bit scary or not great is how, and I want to tie this back to the theme of the session. So we're going to be coming back to that. I'll land the plane on this, on that thought. But the frequent AI users are also more likely to be concerned that AI will take their jobs. So we ask people, and this is in a separate paper. I title it the sum of all workplace fears is the title, and try to make as many cute titles as possible
I
for
love it.
papers. Yeah. So we asked people about how likely do you think that AI is going to kind of take your job in the next 5 years, going from very concerned, somewhat concerned, kind of like a neutral to not concerned at all. So only 3% are very concerned. So number one is that there's probably like people have been citing like this Ipsos survey. Let me not go on a detour about the pros and cons of that survey, but they were like 50%. Ours is closer to 3%. Then an additional about 16% say somewhat likely. So call it 18% or somewhat or very concerned. But what we find is that managers are able to offset that concern almost entirely. So if you don't have a great manager, like if your manager doesn't treat you with respect, then when the more that you use AI, you're looking at like, you're like, hey, this thing is going to displace me and I'm not valued within my workplace. So I might be out of a job. And so I think a lot of times this tension in organizations is happening for completely avoidable reasons. Yes, there are going to be jobs that do fundamentally change, but there's also just a lot of jobs where like, hey, if the management was a little bit better and actually treated people with respect and had clear communication, et cetera, it would be different. So I think from a governance angle, and this is something that'll come up a lot during our panel discussion, and probably something Joseph will probably talk a little bit more about the cybersecurity part. Chris will probably talk a little bit more about the kind of like law and what is lawful for a company to do and what are the bounds of the law and the intellectual property foundations of it. But I think a big concept is going to be this, how do organizations leverage LLMs, but not do so in a way that's creating fear. And managers will be at that critical link where it's like, hey, everybody, there's all these new tasks that you're now able to do. And just because you're not doing X anymore and you're doing Y, you're still valued. There's still a place for you. And by the way, the market can grow bigger. It's not this zero sum mentality of like the market is shrinking and there's this finite set of tasks or finite set of, jobs. It's like the market could expand. So yeah, time will tell, but very optimistic.
Yeah. So in your work, you talk a lot about strategic complements, and you talk about strategic complements such as management practices, worker skills, data systems, organizational change. So what are some of these complements, and how do they determine whether the same technology might produce different outcomes across firms?
Yeah. So the headline result of that managerial transmission paper is that when workers adopt AI, but they really don't trust their senior leadership, it's going to lead to higher burnout, lower job satisfaction, higher probability of turnover, lower employee engagement. But when the opposite is true, the opposite results happen. That when there is this kind of complementarity between management practices, in particular, trust and senior leadership was one of the most predictive ones. When there is that trust and senior leadership, then AI adoption does lead to higher job satisfaction, lower burnout, higher employee engagement. And so it's sort of this asymmetry that emerges within the workplace. Now, how does an organization inculcate this? It's not an overnight phenomenon. I mean, building up trust in senior leadership requires this communication of respect. It requires communication and just being transparent. It requires actual caring about what workers think and not just talking the talk. So I don't want to pretend like all of that is easy, but it is to say that there are these kind of structural factors that mattered before, they matter now, and that there is this kind of strategic complementarity in terms of adoption. That's why when you get people on both like that go to either extreme. It's either like the AGI world or like the AI slop, and it's all AI slop. But I mean, there's clearly an in between, and clearly there's organizations that are finding it useful. I mean, is like the world that messed up that like literally everybody is using it because they're out of their minds? No, clearly some people are finding value in it, and it's showing. Now, can we properly measure productivity? Can we properly measure intangible capital? No, I mean, these are latent variables that are deeply difficult to measure. But I mean, at least according to some of the results I'm finding so far, there are these kind of positive productivity effects that we're finding. It's just that if you look at like national data, there's this kind of attenuation bias. And so you really have to drill down to these very different workplaces because some are adopting it well and others aren't. And if you kind of slam the two together, you're going to get a mishmash of a lot of heterogeneous treatment effects.
Yeah.
Oh, the last thing I'll mention, sorry, Derek, is just because you prompted me about kind of the panel dimension, and so I think this is sort of like nothing that I'm saying. I think is going to come as like rocket science to anyone that's listening because it's like, yeah, who would have thought good management practices really matter? I think part of the salience of this data and this paper is that because it's longitudinal, that allows me to exploit within person variation. So take like Joe, who's at company one in 2024, but then moves to a different company in 2025. I'm using that same within person variation, but exposed to different management practices. So that's a cleaner sort of variation. And it's not just capturing the cross-sectional factors of like, well, Joe is different than John and different than, Tim and so on. So these are cross-sectional comparisons. No, we can do within person comparisons, and it's very fruitful that way.
Right, right. That's an incredibly valuable data set and an approach to take. So we look forward to more of that work coming out. So let's talk a little bit about policy and policymakers. So if policymakers are regulating AI or thinking about regulating AI primarily through technical characteristics, so if they're thinking about model size or training compute or benchmark performance or guardrail, other kinds of technical aspects, what might they be getting wrong in terms of how to approach AI regulation or governance?
Well, I want to throw this back to you in just a minute and tell and maybe read out some of what happened in Geneva. But I think the easiest answer, and this is actually the subject of a different paper with another friend named Klaus Bachmann in Frankfurt. So what we did is we basically used OpenRouter to query different vintages of different LLMs. So take like a year ago ChatGPT, a year ago Claude versus today. And we create these exposure to generative AI. So for those that have been following the exposure debate around like Alonso et al. Had this GPTs or GPTs paper in Science in 2024, and they created this really useful measure of Gen AI exposure. And so there's an open question of, well, these models have improved. Do exposure scores in 2024 predict exposure scores in 2025? The answer is yes, they're highly correlated, and there's this monotonic relationship that the LLMs that are better then are also better today. But just looking at model improvements doesn't get at like the actual deployment. And so then what we do is we get at like the technical capabilities of how well can an LLM do a certain task, but then we also bundle in certain organizational constraints. And we say things like, well, there's a regulation that prevents you from doing X. There's a organizational friction that prevents you from doing Y, and then we recompute those exposure scores. So even that computation is limited by what we can read from like public regulatory text. But one of the things that you take away from that is that the exposure to a society, at least for the United States, we can replicate this method for other countries, but at least for the United States, exposure scores go down a lot if you basically take into account those constraints. And so in one sense, it's good news because a lot of the concerns about like massive layoffs, I mean, I don't buy it. I think obviously the rhetoric is changing. Some of my own work has been finding that there's actually positive employment effects. So I think the big takeaway for listeners will be that if you just approach it from a technical side, you might get you might miss I mean you're gonna be focusing on all these like really important details that somebody needs to be focused on, but you're gonna maybe miss like the forest for the trees, and you also might be overly pessimistic about LLM's ability to like do all the work in the economy, and it can't, at least because of the constraints and human frictions that exist. But yeah, I'd love to, and curious to hear
Yeah.
your reaction to that, but also tell us about Geneva.
Sure, sure. Well, I'm going to have to keep restraining myself not to follow every interesting thing that you say because we'll stay here forever and never get to land the plane. Uh, but one of the things that did come out of Geneva is this idea of um, equitable distribution. And so one of the key unresolved questions that the panel highlighted was um, who benefits, who captures the surplus from the application of AI to the economy and to labor. So who benefits from that? And so, this idea of, employees, employee ownership, sort of how does this change? Who benefits from the gains and the surplus that comes from applying AI is one of the key questions to wrestle with.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, distribution is such a big issue, and this is part of the tension that exists not only in, I mean, many other countries, but the United States as well. And uh, yeah, I mean, boy, what can one say about this big of a topic? I'd say we need, like, maybe let me say two high-level comments. One is that we need to think about incentives within the economy and profit share. So I got involved in this group called Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations has something called the Institute of Employee Ownership, and I got involved in their group back in I think 2015 or so. And what I was really fascinated by is that there's the performance pay and profit sharing and employee ownership. It's such a multidimensional concept. There's all these different ways to structure these agreements, and there's reasons why employee ownership is not more used. I mean, it passes risk from the firm to the individual, and maybe individuals want to actually shield themselves from some business cycle risk. So there's reasons why it's maybe not used more, but there's also things that in this emerging economy, if there's going to be higher returns to capital, to software capital, to kind of like data center infrastructure, then it makes sense to think about, well, how does an individual get exposure to that upside? And some of it can be invested in the S&P, but some of it maybe is also just in the form of, well, like, hey, how do I invest in my company? And I think, not to go on yet another detour, but it's just a lot of the tax law, it was set up in a way that it makes investing for an accredited investor very easy. But what about retail consumers that just want to get some general exposure? Like, do they have to do Kalshi? Do they have to do like prediction markets? No, there should be some other safer, I don't know, more regulated and secure way to get exposure to these high returns. And then the second thing I just want to think about and put out there is that when you think about incentives and how to get more, like, how do we get people thinking about taking more responsibility? Employee ownership becomes a direct vehicle for that because you see yourself in the firm. And so one of the things that Gallup has pointed to over the years is this decline in employee engagement. And so we're in Europe, it's something like 21% are engaged. In the United States, I think it's closer to 33%. But in general, in the world, employee engagement is pretty darn low. And so how do you get that up? Well, we could, improve management. That's one factor, but also just changing the incentives so that employees see themselves in the firms as well. That is one additional avenue for raising engagement, which would lead to higher human capital accumulation. It would potentially lead to higher productivity. It would lead to people connecting more within the workplace rather than just kind of going and sitting in their cubicle and not talking with each other. So I just see it as a great kind of social force as well. But obviously, it's not a panacea for all of the ills in society, but I think it's a great question.
I think moving in that direction is going to be something that we have to do to think about how do you share the results, the value that comes from applying AI. I think those are great possibilities. So another concept that came out of the global dialogue was this problem of the evidence dilemma, that policymakers seek to shape AI governance through informed decision making. And so they need evidence to be able to make informed decisions. But if we think about what kind of evidence exists and we wait for it to be created, it might be too late because things are moving so quickly. You are in a relatively unique position of being able to have the Gallup infrastructure that you can see so clearly and all of us are familiar with, and academia. So if you were thinking about what would be required to establish real measurement infrastructure for the economic effects of AI, what do you think needs to be there? Do we have enough in Gallup and parts of academia, or do we need new creations? What do we need to be able to measure these economic impacts?
Yeah, I think we definitely need more and better measurement. One of the challenges with national income and product accounts or NEPA is that it measures the things that are most visible, and oftentimes that's like production of goods and services, things that are tangible. But what about all the things that are intangible? So not just software, but also things like goodwill for an organization, brand capital, human capital. So all those forms of intangible capital need better measurement, and there's our efforts to do that. There's something called the Global Intan Project that is a collaboration between the World Intellectual Property Organization and Lewis Business School in Rome. And there's a lot of really exciting efforts. And yeah, I think we just need more of it, more coordination. One thing that's a little bit funny within our community is sometimes like the media can lop onto a certain narrative where they like take, one study that says something that they want or thinks that they'll generate headlines, and then it's like, well, there's like five other studies that show something a little bit different, and maybe it's a little bit more boring, but it's also, maybe helpful to inform people about the collage of evidence that's out there. And so that's why I think policymakers are in a unique position to ask questions and push back when it's like when there's only like one thing that's being presented. What am I missing? What are the other things that are out there? And even if, maybe you do decide to go with that first study instead of the other ones, but you at least need to be informed. So, what is Gallup doing? One of the things that I think really excited about launching this year is a collaboration with Microsoft, where we're partnered together to add in a module on AI in the World Poll. So, for every individual in the World Poll, we're now going to have AI use data, and we'll be able to say what the frequent AI user share is in Nigeria, in Kenya, in South Africa, in UK, in Germany, in France, and like you name the other, we'd be here for another 3 hours, or actually be a good like test of like how many countries can you remember in a sitting. But for every 141 plus countries, we're going to have AI shares, and we're going to do that in perpetuity. So that will be extremely helpful because then we can also start relating that with well-being. Because in the World Poll, we also ask about life satisfaction, we ask about their daily experiences, we ask about their personal finances. We're also going to be taking some variables to a quarterly frequency. So asking about inflation expectations, economic sentiment. So that's all really, really exciting. And then we're kind of figuring out other collaborators to work with. One of my mentors, Eric Bjornson, we wrote a piece in Brookings back in January, and maybe this is a good kind of final thought on this measurement side around how do we take all these like we see different pieces on a chessboard. How do we amalgamate it together? And so the idea was, what if we can combine the telemetry data that's happening on network at a really high frequency and use that to augment survey data? So in our quarterly workforce panel, this is a nationally representative, large-scale survey, et cetera, et cetera. But it's quarterly. So if you want to have monthly indicators, if you want to have state by NAICS 3 or state by SOC 3 by month variation, well, then you have to figure out a way to interpolate, or you have to figure out a way to blow up the sample even bigger. So our thought was basically that combine telemetry data with the survey response data and treat it like what's called a hidden Markov model, where there's a latent variable that you can't really put your finger on, but you treat it as a latent dynamic process that you have multiple measurements of. So if Anthropic were to share like aggregate de-identified data, OpenAI were to share data, Microsoft were to share data, we combine that telemetry data, you're kind of honing in on a latent distribution. So that's something that we're working on, and Eric has launched something called the Economic Observatory out of the Digital Economy Lab, where our Gallup data feeds into their measurement. So I think that, more efforts the better. And I would just push everybody. How do we collaborate more? How do we coordinate more? And not like, how do we become like the new Greek city states where it's like Sparta versus Athens and you get the Peloponnesian War? That's not going to do the world any good. We have to figure out ways to work together and put egos aside.
Yeah, I can't restrain myself from following up on that. Just one little piece. So I love that collaboration, and I love the idea of thinking about ways of measuring use and frequent use, maybe in even different ways. Are you thinking of how to unpack what that means for frequent use? How is somebody
Oh,
using
yeah.
that? because on the one hand, you could have someone who's just using it like a Google search, and somebody else who's creating, as you said, BibTeX references for a LaTeX document, and beyond,
Yeah.
and right, more than that. And so um, use is a fairly slippery concept.
Well, it's highly heterogeneous.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. And the competitions that some companies have had for token maxing and leaderboards, people, instead of just bearing down and coming up with really interesting things, people were writing code to burn more tokens just so they would appear high on the leaderboard. Uh,
Yeah.
so how are you really thinking about use and measuring
Yeah.
use as we go forward?
Well, I think that last example that you gave is like right on the nail, and it's sort of it shows like principal agent problems and something called multitasking. It's like if you create this is the way to success, and somebody is going to find a way to pedal to the metal and do well on that one metric, but it kind of completely missed the boat. So I think taking a multidimensional approach is going to be critical. So here's an analogy: is that when this literature in labor economics around skill bias technical change started off by measuring skilled workers based on whether or not they have a college degree. And in the like 1980s, that was an okay measure ish. It's still overly narrow, but an okay measure ish. But today, doing it based on like, do you have a college degree is an extremely noisy measure. And so I sort of think, and yet there's still people to do that, but I sort of think that today our frequent AI use is a okay proxy. We're going to have to evolve it and ask it in a more multidimensional way. We already ask about how they're using AI within the organization. And I think if it's like figure 10 or 9 or 11 in the managerial transmission paper, but one of the things that I show is that good management practices not only raise the frequency of using AI, but it also gets at using it in higher value tasks like learning new things, automating basic tasks, consolidating information. And then the other caveat is that in the workplace panel, we ask just about using it for work. So it's not getting at personal uses. In the whirlpool deployment, we're going to be asking about school, learning, and work, and we'll be able to tell apart the differences.
Absolutely. This is going to be so exciting. We're in a very exciting time here, no doubt. So your panel at TPRC is going to span economics, communications, regulation, antitrust, cybersecurity, institutional governance. So I'm looking forward to it. So what's the one thing an economist might see that, say, a cybersecurity or antitrust scholar might miss, and vice versa, perhaps?
Well, one of the things I think is going to bring us all together is that again, this theme of like measurement beyond compute and how there's things that are easy to measure and there's things that are hard to measure. And so in antitrust, there's all these kind of unintended consequences that happen on competition around consumer harms. And we have to be, if we're measuring one thing, we have to always be asking ourselves, what else should we be measuring? What are we missing? If we're not asking like, what are we missing? We're probably gonna miss it. And so that's also true in the cyber landscape of like, there's all these great benefits, but there's also new threat vectors that emerge whenever you deploy new technology. And so we're obviously seeing this get played out on a national stage with some of these new tools that just get kind of put out there. And then there's the concern of, well, how are malicious users going to potentially use this for evil? So I think what is going to unite all of our accounts, because admittedly, it is a very broad mandate for the panel. So we kind of just took it as we're going to talk about a lot of exciting stuff. We're going to see where the conversation goes. But I think what will unite all of our accounts is just attention to detail around measurement and not just measuring the upside, thinking about the downside risk and how do we really manage that and create processes for managing it. And because Wayne is at the FCC, because I mean Chris has been in the space for a long time, and Josephine, and so I think we're all going to have like very interesting accounts to use some anecdotes and hopefully make it a very engaging time, not just a up at the table just talking to ourselves for an hour plus. We're gonna really try to make it as story-like and memorable as possible.
It should be wonderful. And I think that the session is going to really generate a discussion that people will take away from TPRC, something that they might not have been able to gather from other AI policy discussions. So let's just end by you giving me a prediction. Um, I know we love to predict. Well, we do, but anyway, we'll come back to that. So, what do you think that we will be measuring about AI in, say, 5 years that we're not measuring today?
Well, when you think about like I think we're starting to recognize that tokens are one it's sort of like a dollar bill. Tokens are visible. But there's all these kind of network effects that are connected to tokens. And so just like the macroeconomic literature has gone from kind of simple neoclassical business cycle to thinking about, well, what sectors are connected? What is the supply chain of a product? I think we're going to have to start thinking about tokens as knowledge graphs, where this token has spillovers on other business lines, companies, the accumulation of new knowledge, the construction of new intellectual property, and how do you trace that lineage of intellectual property so that you can properly give attribution? And if you can't do that, then that opens up new threat vectors to be like, well, now the software is created, but we can't actually figure out where that underlying piece of code came from, which is a new risk. So I think we're going to have to get a hold of it, but it's going to be tough. But I think we can do it.
Absolutely. So, everyone, please join me in thanking Dr. Makridis for his time and for such an insightful discussion. And for those of you who are joining us at TPRC 54 in September, we hope that you see what we promise is going to be a very exciting panel and TPRC conference celebrating our 54th TPRC. So thank you, Christos. We really appreciate it. And everyone, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Derrick.